Sorcha hit the boundary stone with her shoulder, and the pack's territory simply ended. Not gradually, the way forest gives way to meadow, but all at once, the pine scent cutting off, the wolf warmth of communal ground vanishing from beneath her bare feet like a cloth pulled from a table. She stumbled onto frozen earth and felt the change in her marrow. Behind her, 37 members of the Halvanmore pack stood in a rough arc at the tree line. None of them crossed. None of them called her name. Stellan stood at the center of them. He did not look at her. That was the worst of it, not the decree he had spoken 3 minutes ago in the great clearing, not the iron marker that had cut a welt across her palm when the elder pressed it there, not even the cold that was already pulling at her thin dress. It was the deliberate angle of his jaw, turned toward the northern ridge, as though she had already become part of the landscape he did not need to read. The bond between them, the mate bond she had felt as a warm thread behind her sternum for 6 years, was still there. She could feel him even now, 20 feet away and not looking. That was the cruelest design of it. Exile did not break the bond. It only starved it. She had 14 seconds at the boundary stone, she would later count. 14 seconds in which she might have begged. In which she might have told him what she knew, what she had seen in the water reading 2 weeks ago, what the spirit in the old well had pressed into her hands like a burning coal. She did not speak. She turned east and walked into the dark. The exile had been announced on a Tuesday morning in late November, which Sorcha would forever associate afterward with the smell of wood smoke and betrayal. Stellan had called the full gathering before dawn. Unusual, the kind of summons that raised old fear in a pack accustomed to safety. Sorcha had dressed in the dark and gone to him as she always had, trusting, unhurried, smoothing her red braid over one shoulder on the path. She had known something was wrong when she saw Elder Marta's face. Marta was a woman who had delivered 3 of Sorcha's sisters and attended every rite of passage Sorcha had known, and her expression in the pre-dawn torchlight was the expression of someone who had already grieved what was about to happen. The charge Stellan read was ritual trespass. The specific accusation that Sorcha had entered the spirit well in the southern grove without the Elder Council's authorization and had attempted to draw a pack-level vision without sanction, that she had, in doing so, disturbed a bound spirit and potentially weakened the territory's warding, the deep, invisible protection that every Halvanmore wolf relied on without knowing it. He had read it from a document. He had not written it himself, she could tell from the formal phrasing, the specific vocabulary of council law, but he had signed it. She had seen her name in his handwriting at the bottom when Marta turned it toward her. Sorcha of the Halvanmore, cast from the territory by her mate's authority. Effective at dawn. She had looked at him across the clearing and waited for him to meet her eyes. He had not. She had been so cold standing there that her hands went numb before the elder finished speaking. Not from the temperature, the fires were burning. From the specific coldness of being adjudicated by the person whose heartbeat she could track from 2 rooms away, whose shoulder she had slept against for 6 years, who had kissed her forehead the morning of her last birthday and said she was the cleverest wolf he had ever known. He had not asked her why she had gone to the well. He had not asked her what she had seen there. He had signed the document and called the gathering and stood with his back straight and his face carved into something that resembled authority, and he had not once looked at her face. They had met when she was 22 and he was 26, and the bond had announced itself between them with the subtlety of a struck bell. She had been cataloging the pack's stores in the autumn larder, unglamorous work that she had volunteered for precisely because no one else wanted it, and Stellan had ducked through the low door to ask Elder Marta about the winter tally. He had seen Sorcha across the shelved jars of preserved herbs and late fruit, and whatever happened to a wolf in that first moment of recognition had happened to both of them simultaneously. It was not like being struck or like falling, though those were the words people used. It was like a door she had not known was closed in her chest, swinging open, and the air that came through was specific: pine resin, clean wool, the particular warmth of another person's attention given without condition. She had looked up from her ledger and found him looking back, and the expression on his face was the one she would spend the next 6 years trying to deserve. He had been gentle with her in ways that surprised her. She had expected the alpha's usual careful authority: competent, considered, held at a slight remove. What she got instead was a man who asked her opinion on every territorial decision of consequence, who sought her out when the pack politics grew heavy, who had a habit of dropping his forehead to the crown of her head when he was tired, as though she were the steadiest surface he knew. She was not a tracker or a fighter. Her gift was knowing, an old kind of reading, the sort her grandmother had practiced, by which she could hold a question in her mind and find its answer surfacing in water, or smoke, or the grain of weathered wood. It was not a gift the pack valued in the way they valued strength, but Stellan had valued it. Or she had believed he did. The vision she had seen in the spirit well, 2 weeks before her exile, had not been requested. She had gone to collect the late autumn herbs that grew in the deep shade around the well's stone lip, and the spirit had simply reached up through the water and given it to her. Not asked, not waited for her readiness, pushed it into her perception, the way a cold hand grips a wrist. She had seen the pack's warding. She had seen the specific architecture of the protection that lay over Halvanmore territory like an invisible second skin, 300 years old and woven from an original blood promise. And she had seen the rot in it. A place in the eastern border, near the ridge the pack called the Jaw, where the warding was coming apart. Not from attack, from slow, structural failure, the way a rope frays when one fiber breaks and the tension redistributes, and another fiber breaks, and another. Without intervention, the well spirit had shown her, the warding would fail within 1 winter. When it failed, Halvanmore would be exposed, to rival packs, to the older things that waited beyond territorial boundaries, to every threat the warding had been holding at a distance for 3 centuries. She had gone directly to Stellan with this. She had sat across from him at the table in their shared rooms, with the smell of the well still on her hands, and told him exactly what she had seen. She had told him that the warding needed a renewal ritual, that it required someone with a direct connection to the original blood promise, someone of the founding bloodline, and that she believed she was that person. Her grandmother had told her once, in the way grandmothers tell things they do not quite expect to be necessary, that Sorcha's great-great-grandmother had been one of the 3 wolves who made the original promise. Stellan had listened. He had not interrupted. When she finished, he had said he would consult the Elder Council and asked her not to discuss it with anyone until he had. 2 weeks later, he had called the gathering and had her cast out. She walked east for 3 hours before the cold became a problem she could no longer defer. The dress she wore, she had not been permitted to change. The exile had moved faster than she had anticipated, was wool but not heavy wool, and the temperature was well below the point where that distinction became irrelevant. She had no pack connection to draw warmth from. The mate bond gave her a direction. Stellan was northwest. Always northwest, a pull she felt in her back teeth. But it gave her no heat. What it gave her instead was fury. She had told him, she had given him the thing the spirit had put in her hands and trusted him with it, and he had taken it to the Elder Council, and the Elder Council had decided that she was the problem, that the messenger was the trespass. She understood the politics of it. Even now, The council would not want a woman with no official standing telling them that their 300-year warding was failing. They would not want to acknowledge the vision, because acknowledging it required acknowledging the threat, and acknowledging the threat required acknowledging that their authority had not prevented it. It was far easier to remove Sorcha, and Stellan had let them. The bone-deep cold of that was worse than the physical cold. She had expected, at some level, that he would be persuaded by the council's reasoning. He was an alpha who governed by consensus, and the council had been his primary support for 3 years. But she had not expected him not to look at her. She pressed onward through a stand of birch, the pale trunks ghost-like in the early light. By midday, she had reached the edge of the high ground, where the terrain dropped into the valley the pack called the Pale, a long stretch of wetland and old-growth forest that formed the boundary between Halvanmore territory and what lay beyond. What lay beyond had no name in current usage, because Halvanmore wolves did not go there. Sorcha stood at the top of the drop and looked down into it. The valley below was not dark, exactly. It was the color of late winter, silver and gray, and the faint bronze of old bracken, and it was very quiet in the way that alive things are quiet, which is different from the quiet of empty places. She could feel something down there paying attention, the way you feel a gaze on the back of your neck before you locate its source. She went down. The first 2 days in the Pale she spent solving basic problems: water, shelter, fire, food. She was methodical about it in a way that surprised her, given that she had never trained for wilderness survival and her skills ran to the intellectual rather than the practical. But necessity is a more efficient teacher than any curriculum, and the alternative to figuring it out was lying down in the bracken and letting the cold finish what the exile had started, and she discovered, with some interest, that she had no intention of doing that. On the 3rd day, she found the spring. It was tucked under a granite outcrop in the deep part of the valley, the water so clear it was nearly invisible, identifiable mainly by sound. She knelt at its edge to drink and felt the familiar sensation of a spirit's attention, not the aggressive reach of the Halvanmore Well's spirit, but a quieter regard, the patient awareness of something very old watching something relatively young make decisions. "I know you are there," she said. The water shifted, not wind. The surface moved from beneath, a slow disturbance, and when it settled, Sorcha found herself looking at a reflection that was not her own. The spirit in this water was not the same as the one in the pack well. This one was older, its presence more diffuse, less urgent. But it was reading her with the same thoroughness, cataloging what she was: the red braid, the cold reddened face, the mate bond that was still lit behind her sternum, like a lamp in an empty house. "Tell me what I need to know," she said, not a plea, a statement of negotiation. What the spirit showed her took the better part of an hour. Sorcha sat at the spring's edge in the cold and watched the water give her images like pages being turned. The warding's original construction, the blood promise, the specific incantation that had sealed it. The name of the 3rd wolf, her ancestor, and the particular shape of the power that had passed down the female line of that family unchanged, and until now, dormant. She was not, as she had always been told she was, a wolf with a minor gift for reading. She was a living anchor point for the oldest working protection the pack possessed. The spirit well in Halvanmore had been trying to tell her this for years, surfacing small visions, priming her. The full knowledge had been waiting for the moment she was outside the territory's boundaries, because inside them, the warding itself suppressed the recognition. The pack's protection had been, in a profound structural irony, preventing the only person capable of renewing it from knowing she could. Stellan had exiled her into the precise condition she needed to be in to become what she already was. The bond pulled northwest, and she did not follow it. She stayed in the Pale for 23 days. The spring spirit proved to be not merely a source of water and vision, but something more complex, a witness, a repository, a library of the territorial history that the pack's oral tradition had long since simplified into legend. Sorcha learned. She sat at the water's edge morning and evening and absorbed what it offered, and between those sessions, she walked the valley and began to understand its geography with the bone-knowing of someone who had grown up in a different landscape entirely. The Pale was not dead land. It was unclaimed land, which is different, a place that had never consented to belong to a single pack, that held its own older allegiances. The things that lived in it were wary of her for the first week and curious about her in the second, and by the third week she had begun to understand their wariness. They knew what she carried. The dormant anchor power, awakening, had a particular resonance that the old creatures of unclaimed land could feel the way a struck tuning fork can be felt in the chest before it is heard. On the 18th day, she began to practice. The renewal ritual was not something she could perform alone. It required the anchor of the founding bloodline and the consent of the pack's current alpha. That was the mechanism, the structural requirement that the blood promise had built in. Warding is a collective thing. It cannot be imposed. But she could prepare herself. She could wake the dormant power fully, burn off the rust of its long disuse, learn to hold it without flinching. It hurt, the first several times. Not metaphorically, her hands trembled and her vision whitened at the edges, and the mate bond blazed with sudden intensity as though Stellan felt something happening without knowing what. On the 20th day, she held the full awakening for 11 minutes before she had to let it settle. On the 22nd day, she held it for an hour, standing in the spring shallows with the water cold around her ankles and the valley very still and her face perfectly calm. On the 23rd day, she put on her rebuilt warmth, the furs she had assembled, the boots she had constructed from bark and layered cloth, the quiet authority she had been building since the first moment she stepped off the boundary stone, and she turned northwest. She felt the territory boundary from half a mile out. The warding's edge had a texture she had not been able to read from inside it, but from the outside she could feel exactly what the spirit had shown her, the fraying at the eastern ridge, the structural compromise that was pulling at the whole architecture from one corner. It had progressed in 23 days. It was close. She crossed into Halvanmore territory at a point no one would expect, coming up from the south through a deer path in the heavy timber, and was inside the tree line for 20 minutes before the first sentry found her. Petra, second youngest of the Eastern Scouts, stood 10 feet away with her mouth open. "Sorcha," Petra said, and the single word held 3 things: shock, recognition, and relief, in a proportion that told Sorcha something important had changed in 23 days. "Take me to Stellan," Sorcha said. They found him at the edge of the eastern ridge. Of course they did. Of course he was already there, because he could feel what was happening to the warding, even if he did not know what he was feeling. He was standing on the jaw with Elder Marta and 2 of the junior council members, all of them looking eastward with the particular expression of people watching a storm approach from a direction they cannot explain. He turned when she stepped out of the tree line, and this time he looked at her. The bond between them detonated. She had been managing it for 23 days from a distance, holding it the way you hold a pulled muscle. Present, aching, careful. Proximity collapsed the distance all at once. She felt his recognition hit the bond like a thrown stone hitting water, concentric and immediate, and she saw his face do something involuntary, a muscle in his jaw, the slight parting of his lips, the way his eyes moved over her with an inventory speed that was nothing like authority and everything like fear she had put into him by her absence. He started toward her. She held up one hand, palm out, and he stopped. "I'm not here for a conversation about what happened," she said. Her voice was level. She had planned this moment, had walked 20 miles, rehearsing exactly this tone. "I'm here because your warding is failing, and you need me to fix it. When it's done, we talk, not before." Stellan looked at her for a long moment. She watched him work through the things he wanted to say, the apology that was clearly already forming, the explanations he had probably been rehearsing for 23 days of his own. She watched him measure all of it against what she had just said and make the decision, because he was, whatever else he was, a man who understood when the pack's survival outweighed his personal need for absolution. "Tell me what you need," he said. She told him. Elder Marta had the grace to go pale. The junior council members had the good sense to stay quiet. Stellan listened without interrupting, and when Sorcha finished explaining the ritual requirement, the founding bloodline anchor, the Alpha's consent, the specific working she had learned from the spring spirit, he said, "My consent. You need it stated aloud, before witnesses?" Yes, he said it, simply, formally, in the Alpha's full authority voice that carried over the ridge like a bell. "I consent to the warding renewal and acknowledge Sorcha of the founding bloodline as its authorized anchor. Before these witnesses, my authority supports it." Marta exhaled slowly beside him. "The council should have been told sooner," she said, and Sorcha recognized this as the closest thing to an apology Marta was capable of offering. "Yes," Sorcha agreed, and turned to the east. The working took 40 minutes. She stood at the specific point on the jaw where the warding's fraying was worst, with the pack gathered at a distance behind her because Petra had apparently run for everyone the moment she found Sorcha in the timber, and she held the anchor power open and let it flow into the warding's architecture the way water finds the shape of a vessel. It hurt in the specific way of large things requiring her full attention, and it was also, she noted with some interest, the most completely herself she had ever felt. Not in spite of the pain, but including it. The power and the cost were the same thing, and both of them were hers. The warding sealed. She felt it close like a hand making a fist, solid and whole, the eastern edge drawing tight against the territory boundary, with a resonance she could feel in her sternum. She dropped to one knee for a moment, purely practical, because her legs had decided the dramatic moment was complete. Stellan was beside her before she registered him moving, one hand on her arm, and the mate bond sang between them in the low register it used when he was frightened. "Sorcha." She let him take her arm. She did not lean into him. Not yet. She let him help her stand, and when she was steady, she stepped back, precisely far enough to make the boundary clear, and looked at him in the long afternoon light on the jaw, with the pack watching behind him. "Now," she said, "we talk." They went to the room that had been theirs, which was unchanged. This struck her, the absence of change in a space that had held 6 years of shared life. His jacket on the same hook, her herb press on the table beside the window, the familiar wool blanket on the chair by the fire, which Stellan had lit before she arrived and which was already warming the room. He had known she would come. He had kept the room ready. She stood near the window and watched him settle against the table's edge and find his first words. He was not a man who struggled with words generally. That was one of the things she had loved about him, the directness of his speech. But he was struggling now, and she let him struggle rather than meeting him halfway. "I knew what you saw was real," he said, "the moment you told me. I have never once in 6 years doubted your reading." "Then why?" Because the council told me you had entered the spirit well alone, and that a lone wolf entering the well without sanction was grounds for exile under pack law. And he stopped, pressed his hand flat against the table. I told myself I was bound by the law, that I could not be seen to exempt my mate from a consequence that applied to everyone else. You exempted your judgment, she said. You decided their interpretation of the law was correct, and mine was irrelevant. You signed the document before you asked me a single question. He didn't flinch from that. He said, yes. The fire cracked. She could feel the warding solid around the territory now, a warm presence at the edge of her awareness, whole and renewed. She had done the thing that needed doing. He had not. I went to the well because the spirit called me, she said, not for curiosity, not for ambition, because it had something the pack needed, and it chose me to carry it. And the council's response, and your response, was to remove the person carrying the message rather than hear it. I know. You chose your political position over my safety. You chose the council's comfort over my truth. You sent me into unclaimed territory in a wool dress in November. Her voice was not raised. She had passed through the stage of wanting to shout about it somewhere around day 12 in the Pale. What she had now was clarity. You believed I could be wrong, and the council could be right, and so you signed. And then you didn't look at me. He crossed the room then, which she had not expected, closing the distance between them in a few steps, and he did not touch her. He stopped just within reach and let the proximity say what it said, which the mate bond translated without ambiguity. She could feel the exact quality of his attention, not desperation, not the grasping need of a man trying to recover what he had damaged, just the specific gravity of him, oriented toward her, the same gravity she had felt for 6 years, and the admission in his face that it had not shifted 1 degree in her absence. I have stood at the boundary stone every morning since the 3rd day, he said. Petra will tell you. I stood there, and I looked east, and I tried to feel whether you were alive. You could feel it, she said. The bond doesn't break in exile. I know that now. I did not feel it clearly enough in the room when they put the document in front of me. His voice was low and careful, the register he used when he was being exactly honest rather than diplomatic. I failed you in a specific way. I let the council convince me that following their law was the same as following my conscience, and it was not, and I have thought about nothing else for 23 days. The fire shifted. She looked at his face, which was the face she had been looking at for 6 years, the particular set of it in firelight, the gray eyes that had never once looked at her as though she were less than she was, except on the morning of the exile when he had looked at the northern ridge instead. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was a separate event from this, a slower and more deliberate thing that she was not yet ready to begin. But she crossed the 3 feet between them and put her hand against his jaw and felt the mate bond rush through the contact like water through a broken dam. 6 weeks of managed distance, releasing all at once, the warmth of it, the specific rightness of his presence against her palm. His hand came up to cover hers and he held it there, pressing her fingers against his cheek. And for a moment neither of them spoke because the speaking was not the primary language happening. I'm angry, she said, very quietly, into the few inches between them. I know. I am going to be angry for a long time. Yes. And when I'm done being angry, she paused, feeling the bond settle between them into something steadier than it had been even before the exile, as though the fracture and the renewal had done something to its architecture that their 6 years of careful, ordinary love had never managed. When I'm done, it will not be because you need me to stop. It will be because I have decided to. He nodded, his jaw moving against her palm. She kissed him, then, because she chose to, Not because the bond required it, not because the proximity had simply eroded her decision. She kissed him the way you kiss a person, when you want to be absolutely certain they understand the distinction between your desire and your obligation, and he received it the same way, carefully, with both hands moving to her face, not pulling her in, but just holding the contact as though she were something he intended to keep being careful with from now on. When she stepped back, she looked at him steadily in the firelight, and what she felt was not the warm thread bond she had known before, not the comfortable certainty of belonging to something she hadn't quite examined. What she felt was the warding she had renewed still resonant in her sternum, and her own power settled in her hands, and the mate bond alive between them with the full knowledge of what she was and what she had chosen. She was the founding bloodline, the warding's anchor, the woman who had walked into the Pale in a wool dress in November and walked back out with something the pack needed, and she alone could give. She was also, separately and simultaneously, deeply furious with the man standing 3 feet away, and in love with him, and not reconciled with him, and choosing to stay. These things did not resolve each other. She was learning that they did not need to. Stellan said, "What do you need from me tonight?" She thought about it. "Tea," she said. "And you can start by telling me everything the council said to you before you signed. All of it, without the diplomatic version." A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "That will take a while. I have time." He put the kettle on and sat across from her at the table, and the firelight settled into the room, and outside the Halvanmore warding held its territory boundary against the winter dark, solid and renewed and anchored by a woman who had only needed the space to become what she already was. She let him talk. She asked sharp questions when his account smoothed over inconvenient details, and he answered them without flinching, which was either growth or the behavior of a man who understood he had no leverage with her and was therefore not trying to find any. She did not know yet which it was, and the not knowing was part of the work ahead. Trust, once signed away on a document, does not return simply because the person who signed it is sorry. It is rebuilt with small repeated evidence over long time in the ordinary unspectacular transactions of a shared life. She knew this because she was her grandmother's granddaughter and her great-great-grandmother's legacy, and the women in her line had always known that love is not a feeling so much as a practice, and practices can be resumed, and they can be changed, and sometimes the breaking of a thing is exactly what was needed for you to understand how much stronger it can be rebuilt. Elder Marta came to the door an hour later, knocking rather than entering, which was itself a significant revision of her usual authority. She asked to speak with Sorcha in the morning, and Sorcha said yes, at her convenience, not the council's, and Marta agreed to those terms in a voice that suggested she had spent 23 days reconsidering quite a number of things. The pack that gathered at the edge of the jaw, at sunset the following evening, was the same pack that had stood at the boundary stone and watched Sorcha walk into the dark. 37 wolves, the same faces, the same people who had not called her name. They were quieter now than they had been then, and they looked at her differently, not with the avoidance of people managing a difficult duty, but with something that took her a moment to identify. It was the specific regard of a community for someone who has been necessary and known it, and it settled into her chest alongside the warding resonance and the renewed bond and the ongoing anger, all of it coexisting, none of it canceling the rest out. Stellan stood beside her on the ridge, not at the center of the group. That was also new, a deliberate positioning that said something without words. She was not standing at his side in the role of mate. They were standing together, and the distinction was not subtle. She addressed the pack briefly, because there was nothing elaborate to say. The warding was renewed, The territory was safe. She would be taking a formal role in the council's working knowledge of the pack's spiritual protections, effective immediately, and the elder council had agreed to this. She watched Marta's face as she said it and saw no objection, only the composure of a woman keeping her word. After, when the pack dispersed back to their fires and their ordinary November evening, Sorcha stayed on the jaw until the last of the light went out over the western ridge. Stellan stayed with her, not touching, not speaking, just present in the cold in the way of someone who is demonstrating, rather than promising, that he will not leave. The bond between them was warm in the dark. She had not forgiven him. She had not said she wouldn't. She had come back to a place that had cast her out, and she had fixed what was broken, and she had demanded to be heard, and she had been heard, and none of that was the same as forgiveness, and all of it was the beginning of something she had not had before. Not the comfortable certainty that he valued her, but the tested, friction-worn, documented knowledge of what she was worth, confirmed not by his opinion of her, but by what she had done when left alone with nothing but the cold and her own capability. That was hers. It could not be exiled. It could not be signed away on any document. When she finally turned from the ridge and walked back toward the fires, Stellan walked beside her, and she let their hands find each other in the dark. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the deliberate choice of a woman who knew exactly who she was, reaching for what she had decided to keep. The warding held. The territory was whole. Sorcha of the founding bloodline walked home under the winter stars, and the cold at her back was the cold of a thing that was behind her now, and the warmth at her side was the work she had chosen, and both of them were hers. The first week back was not peaceful. Sorcha had not expected it to be. The council meetings began on Thursday, 2 days after the warding renewal, and they were difficult in the particular way of institutions confronting evidence that their procedures had nearly destroyed them. Elder Marta ran them with her usual precision, but there was a new quality to her attention, a listening quality, where before there had been only a receiving quality, the difference between a mind genuinely open and a mind going through the motions of openness. Sorcha noted it, without remarking on it. She sat at the council table for the first time in 6 years of being Stellan's mate, in the chair that had always technically been available to her and had never once been offered, and she spoke when she had something to say, and was silent when she did not, and she watched the room recalibrate around her presence. 2 of the junior council members were uncomfortable with her. She could feel it, not the mate bond, just ordinary social perception, the slight excess of formality that people deploy when they are managing discomfort they believe they should not have. She did not ease it for them. That was their work to do, not hers. On Saturday, Stellan came to the spring in the southern grove with her. Not the wild spring in the Pale, the pack's own spirit well, the one whose spirit had been reaching toward her for years and had finally managed to get its message across. He stood at the well's edge and looked into the water with the expression of a man attempting to understand something that has always been present in his territory and that he had not previously thought to examine. "Does it speak to everyone?" he asked. "It speaks to whoever it chooses," Sorcha said. "It chose me because of the bloodline, but that does not mean it has nothing to say to you." He crouched at the well's lip and looked for a long moment. She watched the water's surface stay still, and then not stay still. A slow movement, the spirit's attention shifting. Stellan went very quiet. Whatever the well showed him, it showed him for 2 minutes before he stood, and when he straightened his face, had the particular openness of someone who has just had a private accounting with something they owe. He did not tell her what he saw. She did not ask. Some debts are settled in private, and the spirit well's business was its own. What he did do, that evening, was bring her grandmother's letters from the locked chest at the bottom of the storage room. She had not known they were there. She had believed them lost when her grandmother died, 5 years before her bonding to Stellan. He set the tied bundle on the table between them and said, "Marta gave them to me 2 years ago. She said your grandmother had asked her to hold them until you were ready. I kept meaning to tell you and He stopped. I kept finding reasons to wait." Sorcha untied the bundle with careful hands. 11 letters, the paper brittle and slightly foxed at the edges, her grandmother's handwriting small and very precise, the same handwriting she had spent her childhood trying to copy in her own schoolwork. She did not read them at the table with Stellan watching. She took them to the chair by the fire and read them slowly, one at a time. And what they contained was the most complete account of the founding bloodline she had ever encountered. Her grandmother's own understanding of the anchor power, the warding's history, the specific inheritance that had passed down the female line and that her grandmother had suspected was living in Sorcha from the time she was a small child pulling visions from reflecting puddles. There was a line in the 7th letter that she read 3 times. "The power does not look like power until it is needed. Until then, it looks like a peculiar habit of mind, and the world will call it a minor gift, and you must let it call it that. But you must not believe it." She had believed it. For 28 years she had believed her reading was a minor gift, useful, pleasant, hers, but essentially decorative in a world that measured worth by the more obvious currencies of physical strength and pack rank. She had been told so gently and so consistently that she had never thought to question the telling. She looked up from the letters and found Stellan watching her from across the room with the expression she recognized from the autumn larder, 6 years ago. That first unguarded recognition. He was not trying to manage her, or measure her, or fit her into the space the pack had assigned for mates. He was just looking at her the way he had always looked at her when he forgot to be an alpha, which was the way she had always loved him best. "She knew," Sorcha said. "My grandmother knew what I was. She spent years trying to tell me, in the way she could." "Marta knew too, I think," Stellan said. "Not fully, but enough to hold the letters rather than destroy them." Sorcha thought about that. Marta, who had gone pale when the exile decree was read, who had knocked rather than entered, who had agreed to terms without negotiating. A woman who had known something important was living in Sorcha and had not spoken, but had also kept the letters and given them to Stellan rather than burning them. It was not heroism, it was the smallest possible form of preservation, but it was something. "She should have told me herself," Sorcha said. "Yes. And you should have asked me, before you signed anything." "Yes." He said it without the defensive qualifier, the "but the council and the law," that she had half expected to surface even now. Just yes, clean and without escape route. She crossed the room with the 7th letter still in her hand and sat on the arm of the chair closest to where he was standing, and looked up at him in the firelight and said, "I want you to understand something." He waited. "What I did in the Pale, the 23 days, the spring, learning what I was, that was not in spite of what you did, but it is also not something I can give you credit for. You did not make me strong by breaking my trust. I was already strong. The exile only put me somewhere the warding could not suppress it." She paused, feeling for the exact shape of what she needed him to hear. "I need you to know that I would have become this regardless. I need that to be something we both know clearly." Stellan held her gaze. "I know it," he said. "Sorcha, I have always known it. That is what I failed to protect." The fire shifted in the grate. She felt the warding, still resonant at the edge of awareness, and the bond between them, and the letters in her hand, and the long, specific anger that was still present but had changed its texture. From the raw, cold-burning anger of the exile's first days to something more like clear-eyed evaluation. She was assessing what she was rebuilding, and with what material, and on what terms. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, the way he had always done to her, and felt him go still with the precision of a man who understands he is being given something and does not intend to waste it. "We build this differently," she said. "Tell me how." "Equally. The council hears me as a member, not as your mate. The Spirit Well's guidance is not optional for territorial decisions. And the next time someone brings you a document with my name on it, you ask me first." She pulled back far enough to see his face. "Before anything. Every time." "Before anything," he said. "Every time." She kissed him again, slower than the night before, with the full weight of the decision in it, and he held her face in both hands the same way, his thumbs at her jaw, the mate bond moving between them with the deep, steady current of something that had been tested and had held. Not perfectly, the crack was still there, would always be visible to both of them, but the warding she had renewed was stronger at the repaired seam than it had ever been at the original, and she understood, holding on to Stellan in the firelight of the room she had come back to by choice, that some things are like that. The pack outside moved through its ordinary Saturday evening. Fires burned in the common area. Someone was playing a low instrument, a fiddle, she thought, the notes carrying faintly through the shuttered window. The winter dark held the territory boundary, and the warding held the winter dark, and Sorcha of the founding bloodline held all of it in her awareness like the largest and most particular gift her grandmother had spent a lifetime preparing her for. She was the anchor. She was the mate. She was the woman who had walked east in November with nothing and come back in December with everything that mattered, and the two things, what she was to herself and what she was to him, were no longer in competition. They were the same current, running in the same direction, and she had chosen them both, on her own terms, at her own time. The fiddle played on, the fire settled, she did not let go.